I hate change. I was reflecting on change when I prepared this message, but all the change that has occurred in the town where I first grew up. Maybe some like you have had the opportunity to live in the same house and community for the first 20 years of your life, like me, with a few years of not living at home during the school year when I attended college. Maybe in this world, this is unusual. A friend of mine told me this past week that her husband moved 20 times in his lifetime. While she grew up in the same house as her father before her and lived in the same community as many of her ancestors. Well, the mining and mill town of Wawa, Ontario, where I grew up, was a bit isolated. You had to drive 2.5 hours to the nearest large city, Sault Ste. Marie. But growing up in that community was pretty cool, not just in the wintertime. Lots of stuff to do as a kid. You had many of the same friends growing up that you started with in kindergarten and when you graduated with them in high school. That's unusual. In the winter, it was time of tobogganing, go to friends' homes for fresh-baked cookies. And in my neighborhood, no one ever really moved away. Work for my father was pretty stable. And most people in my town lived a middle class or lower middle class, and that's the types of jobs that they had. My mom at that time was a stay-at-home mom. And my dad worked at the same place for 45 years. Our town of just over 4,000 had everything you needed. 2 grocery stores, 3 hardware stores, a lake on the edge of the town where you could go swimming if you could brave the cold water, and ice fishing. We had 4 convenience stores where you could buy candy and popsicles, and we even had our own local chip wagon. We had 2 elementary schools, 1 Catholic, 1 public, and a central high school. And I delivered newspapers on my street, starting when I was 8 years old. And when I got older, 13, I started working in gas stations in one of those convenience stores. And in the early 70s, 1970s now, the last century, there was no lack of work for high school students at all. Everyone had a job if they wanted it. And then when I turned the magical 18, I spent my summers working in the mill where my father was a foreman. Life was good in Wawa until the day that first the mine and later on the mill closed. People moved away. Some got jobs in Sault Ste. Marie where the parent steel mill was located. Or they moved to other towns that still had a mine so that they could work in the mine. And since that time, I've gone back a couple of times, but the community is just a shell of what it was. Depending on forestry or mining, where people have to travel to a mine site a few hours away, stay there for the week, and come home for the weekends. I still value that place, and I may be going back in July because it made a huge impact on me. And I would love to have that feeling of peace and security that I had growing up there. But guess what? Change happened. And Wawa repeated the fate of what happens to one industry resource communities in Canada. And the results of those years of mining have also left a scar on the earth that will probably take years to recover. And the economy changes. But that's just the way of humanity, isn't it? In Walwood, to continue the way it wasn't sustainable. And many of our society today want to strive to go back to the good old days, whatever the good old days were. I've talked about that a lot in my local congregation. But even so, when it comes to change, we resist change, even at times when it is shown that change may be for the better, even when it is proved that the status quo isn't sustainable anymore. Well, today I want to read from the book of Mark, which we read during ordinary time. The start of ordinary time is today, where Jesus talked about a different approach or a change of view. I'm going to read from Mark 2, starting in verse 23 and reading on to Mark 3, verse 6. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. And his disciples walked along, and they began to pick some heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" And he answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In those days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Carrying on in chapter 3, verse 1. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, it says, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. And Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" And he remained silent, it says. And he looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Now, before I get into what I want to talk about, let's realize that the Pharisees were not exactly bad people. There was a reason why they tried to protect and preserve certain practices, such as those laws and traditions and habits that kept them safe. Or hedged in, we would say, in conformity so they didn't stray from the way of God as they understood it. They were trying to keep the people from straying and becoming like those outside the family of Israel. And their history, they knew, was filled with a lot of examples of what happened when they as a people strayed from following their God. And what you did or did not do on the Sabbath day had even greater importance, because it was something that separated them from their pagan neighbors, just like their dietary laws and the practice of circumcision. Sabbath was something that was part of who they were, their DNA. But in their zeal to be right with God, they had strayed even if they didn't realize it. You know, sometimes we're blinded by our circumstances that we don't have a true sense of reality. We get caught in this bubble, right? And I think it's ironic that they did everything to be separate from the pagan neighbors, to keep them safe, and yet here they were living under Roman occupation at the same time. And because of that, they were placed on a collision course with who and what Jesus was all about. because Jesus was operating under a different law, per se, the law of love and compassion. I like how Debbie Thomas in her essay, The Lord of the Sabbath, puts it. She says this: don't we do exactly the same thing when we hold fast to our favorite worship practices, our cherished spiritual disciplines, and our beloved daily rituals? Don't we just as readily decide what is sacred in our own lives and then refuse to budge even when those things become obsolete and lifeless? The Pharisees were not wrong to uphold the Sabbath, she writes. They were absolutely right. But rightness is not love. Rightness is not compassion. Rightness will never get us to Jesus, who is the Lord of the Sabbath. Only compassion will do that. Speaking of herself and speaking of us, she said, this is an unnerving story. It is a story about Jesus walking through the sacred fields of our lives and plucking away what we hold dear. It's a story about Jesus seeing people and we're too holy to notice, and healing people we just as well leave sick. It's a story about a category-busting God who will not allow us to cling to anything less bold, daring, scary, exhilarating, or world-altering than love. I also like how Scott Hosey said about what he said about this passage. It really got me thinking. Eugene Peterson once observed that when you think about it, based on the Genesis account of creation, in God's plan, Adam and Eve's very first day of existence was when? On the Sabbath. On a Sabbath. Humanity began with the proverbial, he says, day off. The human race started its existence on a Sabbath as a reminder of the very reason for which God created us in the first place. He made us in love for love. When love for God and for another sets the Sabbath tone, most nettled the Pharisees and all of what led them to plot Jesus' murder in the end of this story would probably and properly disappear. Again, I think it's ironic that in Mark 3, Jesus asked the question. He says this, Mark 3, verse 4. Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill? And they remained silent. But then afterward, because of what he did, healing the man on the Sabbath, what did they do? They plotted to kill him. The phrase, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, is filled with so much meaning for us as Christians. And the message we are to be living and sharing. Jesus is showing us that everything we do as Christians needs to be filtered through the message of love. Sabbath is about a state of being in relationship with the triune God that was first illustrated in the creation account of Genesis. I really appreciate Eugene Peterson pointing that out. And the story of our human ancestors before when they walked away from that relationship in the garden. Through Jesus, we as believers have entered into the Sabbath life of love. Now that is the backstory of the statements found in Hebrews, the 4th chapter, which is probably another sermon for another time. But the gist of the argument in that chapter was that we have entered into what? The Sabbath rest in Jesus. And that Sabbath is more than one day of a week. So what does this have to do with the subject of change? Well, sometimes structures and the ways of doing things need to be reevaluated through what? The filter of love. Because the church is an organic organization. It moves, it grows, it changes. And we need to be constantly looking at what we do and why we do it in light of being the messengers of reconciliation. What may have been what we did a number of years ago may not work today. We constantly need to be listening to the Spirit of God and follow His lead. That's why I appreciated Debbie Thomas's comments when looking at this passage in Mark. Remember what I said? It's a story about Jesus walking through the sacred fields of our lives and plucking away what we hold dear. It's a story about Jesus seeing people who are too holy to notice and healing people just as if and healing people we just like to leave sick. It's a story about a category-busting God who will not allow us to cling to anything less bold, daring, scary, exhilarating, or world-altering than love. So here in Montreal, we are doing something different. We are restructuring our leadership. That's why I came today, to allow us to better love this neighborhood. But it isn't just up to those people we ordain today. We all have a role to play. You all have a role to play. For Christians, our baptism is an ordination for ministry. We are the ministry of all believers, aren't we? That is why we are going to use the services of a transitional pastor, coach, before we hire a replacement for our beloved Pastor Roger. As I said earlier, this time is intended to allow the congregation to flourish in the future, to give you an opportunity to take a moment in time and picture how you can be a blessing to this part of Montreal. Today, like every day, is a new day. For you, it's a new day. And the future should be looked at with excitement. Who knows what doors God will open for you in the future? Only God knows. So I started this sermon today with a kind of depressing story about my old hometown of Wawa and how change can be at times challenging. The same was true with the Pharisees. This different focus of Jesus, actually not a different focus, but a reintroduction of the true meaning of Sabbath became a threat to his personal well-being. But for those that experienced the love and compassion of God that day, think about the man with the withered hand. It was life-altering. It was different. A new day had begun in his life. We have been given that new life found in the Sabbath rest, so that we too can be the instrument God uses to alter the lives of others. To alter the lives of others.